Welcome, everyone. I am Kirsten Leute, and I head up university relations efforts here at OUP, Osage University Partners for Long. Thank you for joining us today for another OUP webinar. Today, we are hosting our yearly webinar where we answer your questions on venture capital, particularly venture capital and academic institution spinouts. Next slide. As usual, I have two of our managing partners at OUP joining us, Bill Harrington and Marc Singer, and I'll have them introduce themselves. Marc, you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, I'm Marc Singer, and I focus on tech investments within Osage University Partners. I've been in the venture industry for about 29 years at this point, across both good times and bad times. Over to you, Bill.
And my name is Bill Harrington. I'm also managing partner here. I focus on life science. I'm an MD originally and have been in venture both on the West Coast in Silicon Valley and now out here in Philadelphia at OUP for about 25 years. And like Marc, have seen the good, the bad, or I should say the bad, the good, and maybe now the bad again. So we are seeing the cycles play out.
And I'm sure there will be questions on that today, Bill and Marc. So we'll go to the next slide. Thank you both for introducing yourselves. As usual, we are recording our webinars. We always get questions on this. We record the webinars. We do post them afterwards for our academic institution partners. You will find this webinar on our partner portal. You'll find it under resources and OUP webinars. You can find all of our past decks and recordings also on the portal. And then for those of you who aren't at one of our academic institutions in the tech transfer offices, you can find these on our YouTube channel. We don't have the link here, but you can just YouTube. You can look at for Osage University Partners under YouTube, and you'll find all of our recordings there. You'll also, if you're registered for this webinar, you will be receiving an email later this week that will actually have links to the webinar, both the portal and the YouTube version of it. So with that said, we will go to the next slide. There may be some of you who are new to OUP, Osage University Partners. We're a venture capital fund that invests in deep science spinouts from research institutions. We partner with those institutions to learn about their spinout companies and typically invest through participation rights that the institutions may have in those license agreements. We share a portion of our profits with those academic research institutions, and we invest in all areas of deep science, as shown on this particular slide. So we already have Bill here representing our life sciences group, and we have Marc here representing our tech group as well. We're always happy to answer questions about our model, so please reach out to us if you do have any questions on what it is that we do. But now we will get to the substance of our webinar. Go to the next slide, and we have some basic areas that we'll be talking about today. We did have a lot of people actually submit questions beforehand. And so from those about 24 questions, we formulated our agenda into general questions about the startups themselves, then about founders, and finally financials. We always get a lot of questions on how the financials work with startups. We encourage you at the same time to ask your questions during this webinar. We realize that some of you maybe didn't send in questions beforehand. Some of you may end up having questions as we go along here that may come up as we have these discussions. So please put those in the Q&A box. You'll see that usually on the bottom of your screen, on the toolbar down there. We prefer them there rather than in the chat because I can keep better track of them and what we've answered and what we haven't answered. So please use the Q&A tool liberally as you have questions that come up during this webinar. All right, we'll go ahead and just stop the slides because we want you to be able to see the people who are talking. So we're going to have our first question now, which again, we're focusing these initial questions on generally on the startup themselves. And Marc, this first question is to you. What are VCs looking for? What are their must-haves? What are their discerning factors, et cetera?
Great, thanks, Kirsten. And let me give just some high-level commentary on the critical things we're looking for now. Many of these topics we'll come back into as we go into other questions, and we'll go deeper on some of them. So I'll focus on first common aspects across both life science and technology companies that are must-haves for VCs. The first, which is the most obvious one, is the team. And let me talk about what we're looking for there, particularly what we're looking for in a very early stage university spinout. So first, we do want there to be some semblance of a team. We recognize it's early and that the team will grow over time. But generally, we want to invest in people. We view our job as investing in people. And so that means that there is more than one person on the founding team. So a solo founder by themselves can be challenging at the very early stage to raise venture dollars. So what you want to have is more than one person on the team. It is far better to have people on the team with startup experience. So to have a mix of academic experience and entrepreneurial experience. And so you want to have both. In most cases, in venture-backed companies, the founding CEO is in fact an outside entrepreneur, as opposed to an academic. But in about 15% of venture financings now, you'll see that there is a founder who is also serving as the initial CEO. The final point I'd make on the team is it is better to have an incomplete team than a suboptimal team. And what I mean is don't feel like you need to fill all the seats on a team and hire people who are not right for those jobs. You are far better off as you're raising capital saying, we are going to hire, it could be a CEO in the future or a chief scientific officer or something else, rather than putting somebody in that spot who's not the right person long-term. So bad team members are worse than no team members. So that's on the team side. Beyond that, VCs do expect a well thought through strategy. So there's a lot to figure out when you're first starting a company and VCs themselves don't have all the answers. And one of the ways we assess management teams is what are their thoughts on strategy? So we do expect kind of detailed development plans. What is your target market? How do you size that market? How will you go about it? Who will you hire? So the second key component outside of a team is a well thought through strategy that you can articulate to VCs. And then the third main aspect is that you do, if you want to raise venture dollars, you do want a large market opportunity. So VCs are not looking to invest in companies that can be small opportunities. That doesn't mean that those aren't good businesses. They're just not right to raise venture capital. There are lots of businesses where you should not raise venture capital for because they don't need large amounts of money. Maybe you can exit for $50 or $100 million. That can be a great strategy. It's just incompatible with what venture capital investors are looking for. Venture capital investors are looking to build businesses that can be worth $1 billion or more. So you do need a large target market to be able to drive that much value. So those are some of the critical things that VCs are looking for. Then there are a couple of sector-specific aspects that are relevant. Bill, maybe I'll turn it over to you to talk about one or two life science sector-specific aspects that VCs are looking for, and then I can comment on the tech side.
Sure, thanks, Marc. I think for life science, the team, just to comment on the team for a minute, that can take a different form than in tech sometimes, because the initial activities for a life science startup are often focused on laboratory experiments and figuring out what translational experiments need to be done in order to demonstrate and validate the commercial potential of an academic discovery. So sometimes the project manager, entrepreneur can have a different phenotype, a different look than what we would expect to see and hope to see on the tech side. So there are some differences in team composition and timing for building out your team. I think for life science, one of the things that we all focus on is freedom to operate. You know, the world is crowded with IP, and most discoveries build on prior discoveries, and academic research builds on itself. So one thing that we would want to understand is freedom to operate. Oftentimes potential companies come to us with some IP that they may have filed, which is defensive in nature, but haven't really thought through their ability to operate based on prior art. And I think that's something that you want to have a point of view on. You may not need a formal FTO opinion, but at least have a point of view and have thought about it and have some IP attorney that can weigh in on that. I think after that, we'll get into it in the next section, but having a well thought out series of risk reduction steps, and to Marc's point about having a plan and having a large enough opportunity, that's usually not a problem in life science, but having kind of a thoughtful plan for reducing risk over time is. So that's something to think about as well.
Great, thanks, Bill. And then on the tech side, if for tech-oriented university spin-outs, the one thing that we spend a lot of time on is really trying to understand what the product can be. So usually university spin-outs start with great technology and then figure out what market to target that technology to and what product to build. But ultimately, the value comes from the product that's enabled by great technology, but not just from the technology. So we're very product focused when we think about tech investing. What's the value proposition of the product? Who is it targeted for? How does it deliver value to those end users? And so make sure you have a product orientation to the company as opposed to a technology orientation.
Thanks, Marc and Bill. We actually already have a question from our current live audience that I would like to pop in here because it's really relevant. And it is, some VCs like to build their own team and may phase out the original team. Is this the norm and something founders should expect? For example, like you're originally in a CSO role, but you're going to be moved down to an advisor role, or is it fairly rare? And Marc, do you want to go first and then Bill?
Sure. Well, I would say, even though we'll talk about kind of general thoughts on how venture investors think about things, there is no norm in venture in anything. So if you had 10 VCs answer the team question or the question we just answered, you'll hear a wide range of opinions. So definitely recognize that there is never a norm. So you see a wide range of different approaches to teams. So it is not the norm that a VC wants to kind of change out the team. So most VCs want to actually do the opposite. They want to invest in the team that's there. And they will base their investment decision on what do they think of the team that's there. So the best situation is to have a high quality team in place that is a mix of great technical skill and great startup skill. And then that's the easiest way to raise capital, when you have that high quality team in place and the VC can bet on that team with no expectation of changing it out or building a team. So that really is kind of the best path forward. That's very difficult to do in a young startup where you don't have capital yet. So how do you get great entrepreneurs if you don't yet have capital? And that's why kind of oftentimes what you'll see is an incomplete team, including no CEO in place. Now that is harder to raise capital in, but it's possible. And there you want to target VCs who are comfortable pulling in VCs, or they have CEOs, or they have a network, or they have entrepreneurs in residence who can run the company. And so that happens as well, and that is in fact a common path. What you want to try to avoid is a situation where a VC does in fact feel forced to change out a team, and that's where having a bad team becomes the problem. So the worst of all outcomes is having the suboptimal team from the start, because our own experience is anytime you're having to change out the team that you originally backed and believed in, the odds of success go down. And there's some great stories of the opposite, but in general, the odds of success go down. So we prefer not to have to do that, and most VCs prefer not to have to do that.
Anything to add, Bill?
I just think quickly on the life science side, and I'll focus on therapeutics because that's really most of what we see. Often the initial team emerging from a university is focused on academic research, and they may have, as I mentioned earlier, thought about some translational experiments that need to be done really to validate the science. Oftentimes VCs will want to reproduce the founder's academic research in a more robust, commercially focused CRO. But the other thing to think about is very quickly, once that science is validated, investors would like to see, individuals with drug development experience get involved with the company. Because going from a scientific discovery to a drug is a very complicated process, and individuals who have experience in that can be very, very helpful to your efforts early. And it's one of the things we'll get to in a minute, but having a drug discovery expert, someone with that experience and track record, weigh in on your startup as an advisor early on can be very, very helpful and very compelling to investors.
Great, thanks, Bill. Next question to you, Bill. What are the steps you need to take in order to raise a round with VCs, and how do you prepare for those?
It's a great question, and I'll start with something that may seem very obvious, but is often overlooked, and that's do your homework. mean, reach out to the right VC, right? It's a very broad universe of investors, and you'll be surprised how many inquiries we get from companies that really don't fit our investment criteria or pattern or history at all. So as you think about reaching out to VCs, really do your homework. You know, every investor has a website. Figure out what they like to invest in. Maybe what they say they invest in isn't mirrored in what they do invest in. So look at their portfolio. Those companies are almost always listed on their website. I think tech transfer offices have a wealth of knowledge about which investors are active in which spaces, and we can serve as a resource as well. But first of all, you know, it's not a scattershot process. Be selective, be thoughtful, and try to find a warm introduction. You know, a cold email over the transom is usually discarded, but it only takes, generally, if you're working in a university ecosystem, your tech transfer office and the folks working there are a couple of phone calls away from a warm introduction, so take advantage of that. So that's just kind of table stakes. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, and Marc mentioned, is, you know, is your company really a venture candidate? You know, do you need a lot of money for a high growth opportunity where you can retire risk incrementally, and are you willing to give up control? So you got to think about that as well, because any investment from an outside investor, particularly from a VC, will almost always result in a founder losing control, not necessarily to one investor group, but to a board of directors. And that's something you need to be comfortable with. And then as you think about your market opportunity, I'll let Marc talk about tech and the importance of product market fit. But for life science, you know, most of what we see emerging from university labs would be characterized as platform opportunities. It's a biological insight, maybe some new targets, maybe a new way of addressing existing known targets. And those platforms often have multiple potential applications in multiple disease states. And, you know, that's important, but you also need to think about what are the rank order of those potential applications, clinical applications and disease states, and put together a list with some thoughtfulness around why maybe these three opportunities are most attractive. Don't just list 10 opportunities and look at addressable markets and have a $30 billion opportunity. That just shows investors you haven't really thought about it. So think carefully about, for your platform opportunity, what are the one or two or maybe three most attractive opportunities or applications, and why? And then finally, you know, you should approach the investors with an ask. It's, you know, it's how much money do you want? Why do you want it? And what do you want to achieve with it? You know, we're in the business of retiring risk incrementally. And as investors, we're trying to find reasons to kill deals as quickly as we can before they've consumed too much capital. So think about, okay, here are some experiments we really need to do, and I need some funding to do those. And if they're successful, we can move to the next stage. We can raise more money. And if they're not, we can either pivot, move in another direction, or close the opportunity or enterprise down. If it takes $100 million to figure out if your opportunity really is going to work, and there's no clinical or preclinical model or animal model or in vitro model that might help validate it, that's going to be a very tough sell to VCs. So the more you can kind of parse your path forward into incremental steps of risk reduction, I think the more successful those discussions will be.
Do you want add anything to that?
No, I think that was
okay. Yeah, our first three questions, just to let everyone know, are kind of very broad questions, and then we'll get more into some ones that'll be very specific, shorter answers. But these first three questions were just very broad ones, and I think actually very good for setting the stage today. So the next question then is about the decision and criteria that you as a VCs use to make and rank your investment decisions. Could you talk about that, Marc?
Yeah, and this will dovetail directly from everything Bill and I have said. So you could almost say everything we've just talked about are the decision criteria. So the team, obviously critical. Kind of the market opportunity and the product, critical. But then let me go into some other areas that we have talked a little bit less about. So one is, in fact, the return potential, which is an output of the size of the market opportunity, but that's not the only driver of return potential. So we do a small amount of financial analysis. It is not very detailed, where we basically say what multiple on our capital do we expect to generate in success with this opportunity? So to do that analysis, we need to understand how much capital we think it will take this particular company to get all the way to an exit. If it's a life science company, that often could be at the end of a phase 2B trial. So we're modeling out what do we think the capital needs are for all of their clinical trials and their overhead. If it's a tech company, it may be when they reach 50 or $100 million of revenue. And so we're modeling out how much kind of overhead, how much investment do you need to fund the company until they start generating revenue and then through the execution stages. And then we're saying, well, what is it worth in exit? What is it ultimately worth at that exit? And in an early stage company where we think it will take a lot of time and which has a lot of risk, we generally are looking to earn 10 times our investment capital or greater as a return. If it's kind of a middle stage deal that perhaps has already de-risked itself, that number might be 5x or so. So what we do is we have different return expectations given the level of risk and time the opportunity is. And so we're saying we believe this is a 12x opportunity, and that's one major reason we would invest. Or similarly, we might decline to invest because we think the return opportunity is not big enough. Either the amount of capital required is too high, or the valuation that we're paying is too high, or the exit potential isn't big enough. So return potential is an area that is the most analytic piece of our work. It's hard to do at a very early stage, but that's really important. And then the last piece I'll comment on is we think a lot about inflection points, which is, how much capital are you raising now and where does it get you? And at that point in the future, let's say 2 years down the road, what have you proven? What have you de-risked? And what do we think the company is worth then when you're likely raising another round? And so are you raising the right amount of capital to achieve that inflection point? Does it give you enough time? Do you have the right strategy and the right milestones that would, truly reflect a value inflection point? So we think a lot about inflection points. So as you think about the amount of capital you want to raise, make sure you have a plan that gets you to some clear value creation milestones and a clear inflection point, and that you can articulate that to investors.
Thanks, Marc. Bill, a question to you on, someone's made their first pitch or had their first meeting with an investor, but maybe some of the questions weren't fully answered, or you said you would follow up. Talk to me about how that founder follow-up, the importance of it and how it should happen.
Well, I think first of all, you should be comfortable not having all the answers, right? I think it's much better to say I don't know, or I'm not sure, or I'll find out, than to wing it and say something that you're not 100% confident in, because VCs will diligence everything you say. And if you're giving them answers that won't, withstand scrutiny in diligence, then your credibility will be questioned and they'll disengage very quickly. So feel comfortable saying, I don't know, I'll get back to you. If it's a quantitative or a very specific kind of question, those are easy to follow up on. If it's more generic, you may have to do some homework before you follow up and just say, I need to work on that. These are partnerships. These are not buying public stocks where you don't really know anything about a company. These are very close working relationships, and investors want to know that the folks they're going to be partnered with are honest and are forthright and are willing to say what they know and equally what they don't know. So first of all, you should be comfortable not answering questions, but it's incumbent on the team or the founder to make sure they understand where those questions are at the end of the presentation, maybe feed them back to the investor you're pitching, and then say, I will get back to you with those answers, and be sure you do that. And again, if there are some answers you can't answer, right? There are a lot of times we're looking at companies and say, we need the answer to this question, which is not answerable until you do an experiment or a clinical trial, and just say, we don't know, we can't answer it. Here's how we would approach getting the answer, but we may not be able to answer it right now. So I think the most important thing is being upfront with questions you can answer, get those answers back quickly. And for those questions that are really difficult or impossible to answer, kind of frame how you would go about answering it if this investor invested. But you should be comfortable saying, we can't answer that right now. I think that's probably the most important thing to do.
I would add on top of that. Sorry, go ahead, Casey. Just tactically, it's good to have follow-up engagement with investors. Well, one of the things that happens all too often is you'll pitch an investor and you won't be sure if they're interested or not in the meeting, or maybe you walk out thinking maybe they're interested, and then you never hear from them again. And that is very common. And so what you want to have is specific follow-up engagement, ideally that has an action. So the one good way is, hey, we've got a data room, would you like access to it? And you give access to the data room right away. Or you follow up with, there are these 3 questions that I couldn't answer, I'm going to send you, I'll follow up in a couple of days. Or can we set up another call to go through the answers to those questions? You want to relatively quickly after that first meeting, try to engage that VC in a dialogue and a relationship, because that starts building momentum to get them into diligence and then towards an investment. What you want to avoid is pitching and then having no communication for 3 or 4 weeks, because there's a reasonable chance that VC will have forgotten about you by then.
Yeah, I think one tactical approach that I've seen effectively used is to create a question. Sometimes you're pitching investors and they're not asking enough questions, or they don't seem as engaged. Try to come up with a question yourself, or kind of steer the dialogue in a way that they ask a question or you ask a question, and you have some reason to get back to them. Because it is important, I think, just kind of reinforcing Mark's point, you have to get back to them with something. Usually they have questions you can't answer. If they don't, you need to figure out a way to create a question in the room that you say, oh, well, I'll get back to you on that.
Great. We have a bunch of questions coming in from our live audience. I'm going to shoot a couple of them to you, Bill. For life sciences, do VCs prefer a platform tech compared to therapeutics? And what are a couple examples of risk reduction plans that VCs like to see? So kind of 2 different questions there.
Okay, I'll take them in order. So we look at platform versus single asset, not really therapeutics. They're all therapeutics. So platform would be, a novel biology or a novel target that has a number of downstream impacts on a variety of diseases. And depending on how you decide to develop that asset or those assets, you can go in a number of different directions, but the fundamental biology is what the discovery is all about. And usually it's a target that you're trying to develop drugs for, not always. Well, the other side of that are single assets, or rifle shots as they're called in the industry, which are you have a molecule that does something specific and you want to develop it as a therapeutic in a clinical indication. And if it's a molecule with one proposed action, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and that rifle shot is expended and that company's done. In a platform, the idea is we have a first target, a second target, or a first indication, a second, and a third. And oftentimes, as those various opportunities are prosecuted, the lead indication may become less attractive for some reason, but hey, there's 2, 3, and 4 behind it. So you have a variety of options that you try to advance, at least initially in parallel. And then as they advance, various liabilities show up, the market's not as attractive, the molecule isn't as soluble. So, platforms take more money, they're less defined, and it's usually slower to get into the clinic than a single asset or a rifle shot or an individual molecule, but the risk profiles are very different. And again, getting back to my earlier comment, some VCs only invest in platforms. Some VCs only invest in single asset companies or prefer them strongly. And then some have a mix. So if you reach out to a company that likes platforms and their website is full of logos from platform biology companies and you have a rifle shot, they're not even going to return your call. So you really need to kind of parse through that. But I don't think there's any one answer which one is better. I think, it depends on what you have, quite frankly. Right. If you have a molecule that you think has some activity in a disease, you are a rifle shot, don't pitch it as a platform, and find investors that have a history of investing in those.
Great.
And I would add at AEP, we invest in both. Yep. We actually did an analysis recently of what has our performance been on platforms versus single asset companies. And the data is a little bit cloudy. It's not perfectly clear. It's still not cured. It hasn't, we don't have enough time on it, but we've done a little bit better on platform companies, but there's not such an overwhelming bias one way or another in our results. We've had successful outcomes with both, that we continue to invest in both types of life science companies.
Great. Marc, another question from our live audience to you. What value do you put on patents and startups, and how important are international patents? And this person is actually specifically, especially looking at software, therefore the question to you.
Yeah. So the answer is a little different on the tech side versus life science companies, and even more different on software. So I'll take it from a tech perspective and then go specifically in software. Overall, from a tech company perspective, we view patents as enablers, but not value drivers. So they enable you to build, say, a competitive moat and some differentiation and maybe some downside value if things don't work out. But having a great pool of patents doesn't create value in and of itself. What creates value is the product. And the patents may enable you to get to a product and may enable you to have a competitive lead for a while. But in most cases, there are other ways to get to the same endpoint, whether it's a hardware company or a climate technology company. And so the patents themselves are kind of necessary and helpful, but they don't drive the investment thesis for us, and they don't really create value. But they're good. They're good to have, and we prefer that companies have a strong patent portfolio. They help. But again, they're not the defining factor for success. In software specifically, that is the biggest gray area around patents. So there, in general, we view patents as not having much value at all. Sometimes they can have a little value, again, in a competitive lead, but in most cases, there are, again, too many ways to get to the same endpoint, or you kind of have to rewrite your code anyway. And so patents themselves probably have the least value in software than in other areas. It's actually one of many reasons why many years ago we started advocating something called a simple software license, which we've actually done webinars on before, thinking about licensing, university licensing for software, which is still critical and valuable, thinking about doing that a little bit differently than you would say license to a therapeutics company. So in software, there are just too many ways around patents for them to have that much value.
And thoughts on US versus international, any things there? And then we also have a question on US versus global market potential and global supply chain as well.
First, I would say we're not experts in answering that question. Most of our companies are in the US, targeting US markets. And so for the most part, we are focused on the US patent portfolio and the value that brings, but our companies do file internationally. And so we do think it's important, more than anything, to protect yourself against competition, but it's not critical. And we've never invested in a company, let's say, to go to the extreme, that had a great international patent portfolio but didn't have the same protection in the US. That would be a knockout for us. The US is generally the first primary market for us. It is nice in certain countries abroad if you have international protection as well. Bill, is there anything you would add to that part?
No, I think it's largely mirrored with life science, therapeutics for sure.
And again, going to the markets part of that, are you focused? Is it because you're in part just very focused on the US markets themselves?
It definitely is, but also those markets are often the largest markets,
right.
So it is the case. I would say we do have some tech companies that have developed large international markets, both on the hardware side and the software side. But as those companies have gone commercial and now have products, what is enabling their success internationally is still not the patent portfolio. That may have been an enabler, it may not have been. But we do access international markets, and sometimes they can be sizable. The key is just making sure you have the right product for the market.
All right, next question from our live audience is, we are seeing more and more organizations that represent themselves as early stage incubators. They put a small amount of money and business leadership into a few opportunities, and they like university startups where there's a technical team but no business leadership identified. What do you think about these organizations as you look to participate in follow-on rounds? Because obviously, typically these organizations are investing in those very early stage rounds, probably pre-seed, et cetera, where OUP probably is not investing yet, or other large VCs. Sorry, Marc, do you want to go on this one first, and then Bill?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. There's a bunch of different ones of these in different technical areas. So.
Yeah. So we think incubators are great. So we love that they fill a need in the marketplace because they are what they do is they help create more startups and help those startups get to the next level. So they are a great resource in the marketplace, and so we're glad they're there. Frankly, we benefit from them because they create more investment opportunities for us. So we do with university-specific incubators, we do pay close attention to the companies that are going into that. And we go to their demo days, or we interact with those companies directly, because that can create investment candidates for us. So we're big fans of that. The key obviously is that different incubators are good at different things, and make sure that you pick an incubator that you feel like you'll get real value out of. The execution of the incubator matters. And so there are great incubators out there that create great companies. There are less good incubators that aren't necessarily bad, just they just might be kind of focused on one area or have less of an investor network or other things. But in general, we think going into an incubator, in particular, if it's your first startup and you don't have any business experience at all, and this is all new, is a great first step.
Bill, next question to you. Is there any rule of thumb for aligning product development stage with VC series raises? As a life science example, would you expect a startup pursuing Series A to use the funds to support IND enabling studies? So is there any rule of thumb around you're raising this series and this is probably the expected outcome for that type of raise?
You know, it's a good question, and the answer has changed over time. You know, I'm old enough to remember when a Series A would be $5 to $10 million and would get you through some preclinical work and IND enabling studies. Now that Series A could be $50 to $100 million and get you through the same IND enabling studies. So things have become a lot more rigorous and a lot more expensive. But I think that generally, there really is, it's hard to say. A lot of the Series A's we see today were historically, up until 18 months ago, were really a Series A, B, and C wrapped into one. And, you know, the company would raise that money and then, you know, within 18 months, raise a crossover round and be public, you know, 2.5 years after founding, still preclinical, still with a great deal of risk. And we've seen a lot of those companies really crater their market caps in the current public market environment, because they're just not ready to be public. I think what we're seeing is a return to a more normal approach to early stage investment. And again, getting back to incremental risk reduction, you know, a Series A, and the rule of thumb, and it's a very rough rule of thumb, is that takes your discovery, your hit to, you know, you're at a hit to lead stage into something that would be more of a clinical candidate. And then you start your IND enabling study. So I think, you know, an IND itself is probably a Series B target, and then Series C is to actually fund, you know, early clinical experience, phase 1, phase 2A, and then, you know, at that point, every company is unique, and the capital needs to take certain assets forward become pretty disparate. But in general, that's how things have kind of come back to a little more normal cadence of investment.
Great, thanks.
And just to throw in an opportunity to kind of disagree with Bill a little or challenge each other, which we always like to do. Coming from a tech orientation, one of the things I've always had a hard time with is how much capital is required in life science companies, because the way I learned tech investing was you made every dollar count, you stretched it out, and you were incredibly scrappy. And in truth, one of the hallmarks of a CEO I look for today when we're investing is a CEO that's very scrappy, that can both make every dollar count and make every second count. And on the life science side, I've always been troubled by how much capital was required for these companies. And Bill mentioned, like, this is true, like the amount of capital required has gone up dramatically. It used to be a lot, now it's an extraordinary amount just to get through, say, phase 1 trials. And so putting a tech lens on that, I always prefer companies, even on the life science side, that focus on capital efficiency and think about how can they make dollars work. That doesn't happen that often in the life science world. And I would even say, as a data point against my own point of view, our life science companies that have been capital efficient generally haven't done that well. Like, we've done better as investors in companies that have, in fact, been really good at raising lots of capital and targeting big opportunities. But I've always felt troubled by how much capital it takes to get a life science company through a meaningful inflection point.
I think underlying that need is the fact that drug discovery is by nature a very, very inefficient process. There are a lot of blind alleys, a lot of failed experiments, and I think when companies try to be too targeted and too capital efficient, they really leave a lot of stones unturned. And if they get lucky, it can work out. But if they have a more normal path where certain things work, certain things don't work, and certain things are in the middle, having the capital to turn all of those stones over at the same time and really figure it out is one of the reasons, at least we see, I think, there's been such a flood of capital into these life science companies, and it's just such an inefficient process. It's just too hard to pick the right skinny path forward. You've got to cut a pretty wide swath if you want to be assured of success, or at least successfully prosecuting your hypothesis.
Great, thank you both. Marc, moving on to a question that probably could take up a whole webinar itself, but we'll try to keep it brief, which is, what is the best way to pitch in the kind of market that we're in a bear market?
Yeah. Well, the first piece I hit there is what we were just talking about, which is the amount of capital you raise. So you need to be sensitive to the environment we're in. And whether it's a bear market or a bull market, you always need to be context sensitive. First and foremost, because it reflects poorly on you and the management team if you're not. So we are in a challenging market now where raising capital is hard, valuations are down, and as a result, round sizes are down. So when you first develop your thoughts on how much capital you want to raise and how long you want that to last, you need to think about the environment that we're in. So when we see, let's say, life science companies come to us and now want to raise a Series A round of $70 million, we think that reflects poorly on the management team because they are not aware of the times they're in and the context they're in and how hard that is. So you need to have your round size match what is the norm for the current environment. That might now be for a first round of a life science company, $10 million, a second round, 20 or 30. Bill would know those numbers better. Same is true on the tech side. So round sizes have gotten smaller, and make sure you reflect that in your thinking about the strategy of the company. Second, make sure you're sensitive to how long it's going to take you to raise capital in this environment. So the length of time it is now taking to raise rounds has greatly lengthened. I would just venture as a guess that it's doubled or maybe longer, although I don't have good data on that. So you need to plan your own strategy, assuming it's going to take 6 months, let's say, to raise a round, and don't plan anything different. And this is true if you have a pure startup, or let's say if you've raised one round and then you need to start raising your second round. Don't start raising too late. Don't start raising 3 months before you're going to run out of capital, because in this environment, it takes longer. And then the last piece is just be realistic about expected valuation. So we're in a world where there are a wide range of perspectives on valuation. In aggregate, valuations are down, but you do see still isolated data points of some premium valuations in the market. But sometimes we see companies go to market with a valuation paradigm that may have worked 18 months ago, but is out of market with the current context. And what happens when you do that, sometimes these companies will signal that to an investor, we're expecting X valuation, or we want to mark up over the last round of 50%. And what it does is it has investors not even engaged from the start if they think you're so out of market in your valuation expectations. So you either want to not communicate valuation expectations, that's generally the best, we'll let the market decide, or communicate flexibility, because you want to get investors into diligence. And if you come across as too aggressive in valuation to start, that's an easy way for an investor to say, this isn't worth my time. We'll probably never agree on valuation.
Yeah, I just want to follow on. And I think a big turnoff for investors is when they are pitched an opportunity and the management team has a slide or slides describing how the investor can make a certain return based on a certain valuation and investment. And, that's the VC's business. And when, they see that, like, hey, if you invest this much at this price, you can make this return. That really generally is a disqualifier. So I would leave that aside. I think to Marc's point, I would, if you're asked, like, what are your valuation expectations? You can have a point of view, but it's also, the market will decide, which is absolutely the case. And I think to start to bake in why your number makes sense and how the VC, if they invest at that valuation, is guaranteed a great return, really sets you up for failure. So be careful not to do that.
All right, next question is to you, Bill. How much credence does a VC give when they hear a founder pitch say they have soft commitments of a certain number of dollars, but no lead? What's a better approach than this when there are legitimate other participation, but no one has readily stepped up to price a round or be that lead on that round?
That happens a lot where, in the course of pitching, you'll hear investors say, this is interesting, come back to me if you have a lead, right? So a big part of that is people are looking for price discovery in the market. They're not willing to do the work to say, or they're not in a position to do the work to say, hey, we think this is a reasonable price and some reasonable terms for this investment, and put together a lead term sheet on their own. But they find, and we will do this too. We'll see an opportunity come through and we'll say, that's kind of interesting. They don't have a lead. We're not compelled enough to lead it ourselves, but depending on what comes together, we may take another look, right? And so there's that argument. Even investors who can and do lead may take that position. There are a number of investors who are really just followers and rarely, if ever, lead. And they'll express some interest, but remember, the interest is it's the softest of soft circles. So when we hear that, when VCs hear, oh, I've got, a number of investors that are willing to follow, you may be asked, well, who are they? And exactly what have they told you? Because one of the things that I think venture firms hear all the time is, entrepreneurs and management teams, as they pitch VCs, they hear what they want to hear. And when someone says, hey, this sounds interesting, they may take that as a soft circle, when all it is a polite expression that this is interesting. So I think VCs don't put much credibility or credence in the idea that, hey, I've got a lot of soft circled followers, I just need a lead. A lead is a very different beast. So I would be careful not to indicate that unless you know for a fact that an investor has said, hey, we would like to invest if and when you get a lead, and have that subject to diligence.
And the one small thing I would add on is sometimes there's one time where it's an asset, which is if you have a strategic corporate investor who has said they're interested, and it's really true, but they won't lead. Corporate investors, we generally, we like them as investors. We don't always think they make the best lead investors, but they're good investors and they bring something to the table and they're validating. So if you have a soft circle from a corporate investor and can disclose that, I think that can be a real asset in your financing.
Yeah, I think if you're going to do that, you have to be able to disclose it, and the investor has to be able to call that corporate for confirmation. So don't mention it if it's confidential.
Great, thanks both. We're going to finish up our questions on this kind of general area of the startups and then move on to our founders' questions. The next two questions, though, are specific to academic licenses, so I'll just address them really quickly. One is, what is the most irritating issue for VCs and academic licenses with companies they are asked to invest in? And so I think actually if you ask different VCs, they might come up with different things to do with milestones or sub-licensing or a limitation on certain rights, et cetera. But I think what that all stems from is a lack of consistency between what they negotiate with different institutions, that different institutions do things differently, have different priorities. But also sometimes it has to do with perhaps not doing this as much, perhaps as the institutions themselves are doing. And so there are a number of efforts underway to help with this, which is one is the VC Tech Transfer Organization term sheet that Columbia spearheaded a couple of years ago. There are going to be additions to this coming up. We actually have our license terms, startup license terms database that our institutions can use to help them understand kind of what's market on financials. But it's not just financials we're talking about here. It often is just the language in the agreement. And so I think that that's where some of the discontent comes from when going through these licenses. Another one obviously is also the timing and how long licenses take, though I know from experience, having been on both sides, that that is often an issue just on both sides regarding timing. So anything that you want to add to that, Marc or Bill? No. All right, then we also had a question come in about what is your position on investing in companies that have a royalty obligation to the owner of the patent, for example, a university patent. I know at OUP in general, that is the expectation for most types of licenses, not all, that there is going to be a royalty obligation to the university when it has a patent on the product that is being licensed out of the university. So anything else you want to add on that?
No, just call it maybe the corner case we mentioned earlier around software. Software is the one area where royalties are challenging in licenses, and we see lots of friction, disagreement, arguments in licensing around software royalties, in part because the software world, the vast majority of software companies did not have a university origination story, didn't have a license. So you see very few royalties in the software world at large. And so there's just much less kind of, or, you know, people are just not accustomed to them. And so that's the one area where we see royalties a lot less in licenses.
Yes. Great, thank you. We're going to move on to our section about founders now, followed by financials. We have about just over half an hour left with all of you. We know that sometimes people have to drop off at the hour. That's fine. This is being recorded. You can watch the rest later. So the first question was on solo founders. How are solo founders viewed? And Marc, I'll direct that one to you.
Yeah, and I mentioned this earlier. Generally, we prefer a team, not an individual. And so at some point, there's generally a solo founder at some point in time. But when you're raising capital, you do need more than that. And so assuming if there is a solo founder in the case of a university spinout, it's generally PI or somebody in the lab who did the work. And so we do want co-founders. Sometimes we will say to a company, we would like to invest in you, but we need you to have a co-founder and let's help you fund. And in particular, that's somebody who is not academic and has startup experience before or industry experience in the right vertical. So we do want teams, not solo founders. But we do want those teams to be reflective of both the academic strength of the company and the commercial opportunity. So in most of our companies, a grad student or a postdoc who did a lot of the actual hands-on work does go full-time into the company. And we think that's great. That can be part of the team, but that can't be the whole team.
Great. Bill, next question to you. Do you ever invest in the life science graduate students actively pursuing their PhDs?
I think while there's no reason we wouldn't or couldn't, it's vanishingly rare that really happens. I think to Marc's point, oftentimes we see, technology coming out of a PI's lab where there's, some combination of the PI postdocs and grad students that are involved in a given project, and the IP comes out of the university itself. It's rare that the grad student pursuing his or her PhD would have a startup in life science that didn't involve the PI, whose lab were their advisor, whose lab they're working in. And when we do see these companies emerge where the grad students or postdocs are involved, very often one or more of those individuals does move out full-time into the company. As Marc mentioned, that institutional knowledge is very important. the PI may remain, or usually remains, and as an advisor, sometimes chair of the scientific advisory board. Rarely they would move out as well. I've seen it happen, and it's generally not successful. But the postdoc or the grad student who did most of the work, particularly if there's a lot of know-how involved in the experiment, which is commonly the case, that's something that the VCs or the investors might require, let alone welcome.
And then a follow-up question to that, what are some areas where you find first-time life science founders coming from an academic setting need the most coaching? Like what do they really need to learn, but also just need coaching from a mentor or other kind of outside advisor on?
I think for life science, the area that we see the most difficulty for founders is moving from an academic experimental environment to a more robust commercial third-party environment where the standards are much higher, the experiments have to be much more robust and reproducible. And sometimes moving from their homegrown research they do in their lab with their postdocs and grad students, and then you move it to a CRO or into a company lab where you've got the technology transfer component. There's some know-how involved, there's reproducibility and sometimes scalability, and oftentimes those early academic experiments don't replicate. And I think trying to coach the academic founders on the need, why we need to do that, and why they need to pay attention to that can be difficult. It's like, hey, I published on this already, in a leading peer-reviewed journal. Of course, this science works, and but it doesn't replicate in a commercial environment, or it doesn't scale outside of your lab where your postdoc does something special that no one else can seem to do. Not that it's malfeasance or misrepresentation, but just it's hard to take some of that research work and scale it outside of a small academic lab.
I would add, when we're investing in a first-time founder, in particular, it comes from an academic setting, whether they're on the life science side or the tech side, there are two specific things I look for in evaluating that first-time founder. Number one, can they move far faster in the startup world than they have in the academic world? So academics, when we talk about this, they often will say the right things, but they'll also believe that they moved faster in their academic setting than all of their colleagues, that they were fast moving. But the startup world moves 3 or 4 times faster. It just doesn't. So I look for specific markers or indications that they can change their speed, because time is a killer. It costs money. That's a hard transition to make, speeding up. The second is that do they recognize what outside talent looks like as they hire a founding team? That is also hard if you've only been in an academic setting and you haven't been exposed to what great industry talent looks like. So we very much look at the initial team that they've assembled and their thoughts on that team and say, is this indicative of the kind of people they'll hire in the future, and do they have a good eye for talent or not?
Marc, next question is to you. Sometimes faculty have unrealistic expectations of how much startup will own as they begin to seek capital, but also kind of at the end when there's actually an exit of that. And some of that just has to do with not having experienced this before and what their ongoing contributions will be, et cetera. So the question actually from this person is, when is the right time to start setting expectations with those faculty or other founders of the company that perhaps haven't done this before?
Yeah, well, that is a great question because it's a common problem. And first I would say, so it's never too early to educate people around this. And in fact, we have another webinar on founders equity that I think we could put the link into the chat here if people are interested. It's also in our portal if you're interested, and we have the PowerPoint there as well. That will give some actual numbers around this, but it's never too early. And the reason why you should start early is that expectations around equity ownership can actually be company killers. Meaning when you have founders who are doing everything possible to maximize their ownership percentage, as opposed to doing everything possible to maximize the probability of company success, then the odds of that company getting to success decline. And so you want your founders to be oriented towards, we want this company to be successful, we're going to do what's right, and I'm better off with a more diluted stake in a company that has a higher probability of success and big success than I am in owning a higher percentage of a company that goes nowhere. And you need to get, culturally, you need to get the team and the founders on board with that idea very early, so they make the right decisions for the company as opposed to making the right decisions for their ownership position.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Going back to you, Bill, would you elaborate on a good CEO or director of operation for biotech startups? When should the startup hire one? An operation person usually does a lot, if not everything, for the company. What qualities do VCs usually look for in a COO?
Well, I think, looking at companies that are kind of close to their origin from a university lab, what you really need is a project manager, someone who knows drug discovery, who knows drug development, who can kind of link the two and take those experiments, figure out what does industry require to see around chemical matter, around the medicinal chemistry related to that, around manufacturing. And that can all be done early on with someone who's really just a project manager. When we think about a CEO, that's usually someone coming in after those initial steps are done. Occasionally they can join very early. Most companies go through a couple iterations of CEOs. There are those that are very good at taking, scientific research and turning it into a viable company that has a drug development plan in place. And then they transition out and you bring in CEOs who are very comfortable with clinical trials and commercialization and, taking a drug that, is through an IND and is now entering clinical trials, and how to put those trials together for labeling and how to think about commercialization, even though that company may be acquired before they actually reach the market. So CEOs for life science companies go through several iterations, and oftentimes you may start with someone with the title CEO, but really what they are is a project manager. Separating operations, where you have a chief operating officer on top of a CEO, that generally requires a much more complex operating entity than most startups are. And so at that point, you've got a much larger team. If you have a CEO, at that point, the CEO is looking at fundraising and activities kind of externally facing. And your COO, your operating person, is dealing with internal operations. And that generally is a company that's years out from a university and has raised a fair amount of venture money.
Great, thanks, Bill. Our next question, and I think this is kind of our last question on the founders themselves, but we'll see. I'm sure there are other questions coming in. Was actually advice to women faculty who want to start companies yet don't see many women in models. This is an area that I've been working on quite a bit. Other people at our firm have been working on. A lot of folks around the country and around the world have been looking at and trying to help. So in general, there may be fewer women models, but mentors, et cetera, don't need to be gender specific. That may be helpful in certain parts of it, but there are a lot of people out there, and finding a good mentor is one great step that you can take. And there are many different ways you can do this, through asking around to your local colleagues, talking with your tech transfer office, et cetera. We did create a Female Founders Stories, Inspiring Female Founders blog that you can find, that we just put in the chat here. I also worked on a paper exactly on this and what people can be doing to help this area, that we'll also put in to the chat as well. But a lot of this is going out and understanding perhaps how other people did it. And that's the reason that we started putting together these stories, and then taking inspiration from there. But it is, as with any of these founder stories, when you're first doing this for the first time, figuring out what it is that you don't know and what you need to learn is one of the hardest parts. And so getting advice, getting training, et cetera, are the most important parts. And go to those people on your campus, or maybe for some reason your campus doesn't have those opportunities. Figuring out where you can get those opportunities is key. And I'm always happy for anyone to reach out to me if they are looking for something specific that I can help them out with. Anything, Mark and Bill, you want to add there? No?
Yeah.
Okay, we will move on to financials. So Bill, this one's to you. Would you explain your process of estimating a company's current valuation, including why valuations differ?
Sure. I mean, this is kind of the black magic of venture capital. You wonder how do venture investors come up with pre-money valuations for term sheets? And, it's not linked often to anything quantitative. But in fact, the way that we as an industry look at valuation is we start at the back. Marc alluded to this earlier as we kind of rank order opportunities. But we look at, what could this company be worth in success? If it's a drug, how large is the market? What do peak sales look like if it's successful? Oftentimes blockbuster giant markets, when you really look at them, they're segmented into multiple smaller markets, and your particular drug or product only address a smaller portion of that. So we kind of develop a back-end model of, hey, if this all works, what's peak sales and what does that translate into for the value of this molecule in the hands of a big pharma company, let's say. And then we work backwards and say, okay, what do you need to get there? When would this company exit and how much would it be worth? Oftentimes that's sort of a phase 2B, clinical data in patients with a disease against the control arm or standard of care. And that historically, and this is a generalization, but historically that's been where big pharma, big biotech would come in and potentially either strike a partnership deal or an outright acquisition. How much do we think the company would be worth at that stage, given that downstream opportunity? And then we start there and say, okay, well, how much does it take to get there? Well, here's what it would take to do those clinical trials. And then we work back from there and say, okay, if you invest, what is sort of multiple do we need at each step of the way? And so then you get back to that Series A investment and say, well, we need this company we need to be able to make, to Marc's point, 10 times our money for this early stage, high risk investment with no IND enabling work done yet. And if we need 10x return here and we think the company would be worth 100 million when we exit, well, now the company today is worth 10. And if we're raising 5, then the pre-money is 5. You put in another 5, you're at 10, and potentially you could get a 10x. The fact is that most of these companies don't succeed. So when we say 10x, that accounts for the companies that don't succeed. And most VCs are looking for kind of a blended portfolio return between 2 and 3x. And that's actually quite good in our industry. You hear about, 6, 10, 20x funds. Usually those are driven by one outsized performer, but valuation is very much a back to front. And, we start with what's it worth in success? How much money does it take to get there? What are the stages that you would go through? What are the inflection points? And then it's a fairly straight mathematical exercise to figure out what a rational and reasonable pre-money or valuation is, which we call pre-money, which is before the investment goes in.
And I'll add to this just to note that we actually are planning on having some webinars on this and other of these financial topics. Next year, we have a series of them, of about 4 or 5 of them coming up. So stay tuned. There will be a lot more and more in depth on this topic of valuations, but other topics on these financials as well. All right. To you, Marc, about fundraising and the types of fundraising when you fundraise from different groups, and what is the best timing to transition from non-dilutive to dilutive funding methods? Yeah,
so there's no best time. And so kind of the first question that we mentioned earlier is the question you need to answer for yourself of, do you ever need venture? Is it a really big opportunity? And does that really big opportunity require a lot of capital? If that's the case, then you ultimately will need venture, but more companies don't need venture than do. So you do want to have a general orientation towards that. Beyond that, I would say as a general guiding principle, it's good to wait as long as possible to raise a round. So raising capital is very time consuming. It is dilutive. And so if you can find other ways to fund the company and progress your technology and get proof points, we think a lot on the tech side when we're investing of what are the proof points that are here? Do you have corporate partners? Do you have beta customers? What proof points do you have? So the longer you can wait to get more technical development, more proof points, and more non-dilutive capital, the better, as long as you haven't built the culture of a company that's kind of a grant machine. There are some extremes of that. The companies have lived on grants for 10 or 15 years, and that's the culture of the company. And then they try to go raise capital to productize something. That, in some ways, that's too late, but short of that extreme, wait as long as you can and find other sources of capital, which can be government capital, partnerships, NRE, other things. And then as you do get to the point that you're crossing over, you really do want to raise as small amount of capital as possible to get to the inflection point we mentioned earlier. So you need to, think about what's the round size. Generally, you start with smaller rounds and go to larger rounds. So you might raise, I don't know, depending on whether it's a life science or tech company, a $1, $2, or $3 million round if it's a tech company, maybe a $5 million round or more if it's a life science company, and it gets you 2 years. And that's your first round of capital to get some more proof points to then raise the next round, which is a $10 to $20 million round. So you do increment up as you gain additional proof points, de-risk the opportunity, and can raise capital at higher prices. The last thing I would say is another general rule of thumb. It's not always true, but assume it's generally true, is that you don't, the moment you raise outside capital, you start the clock on investors wanting an exit. Investors don't want to be an investor in a private company for 10 years. That's not their goal. And so use as a general kind of rule of thumb, an investor wants to get out within 7 years. So don't raise capital unless you think you can progress the entire company all the way through its development, maturation, and exit within 7 years, because you start the clock when you raise capital. So you can use time to say, do I think I can accomplish all of this in the next 7 years or less?
Thanks, Marc. The next question is one that I'm going to take, which is what are the norms for equity types being granted to universities from the startup companies that they're licensing? For example, preferred versus common, convertible debt, warrants, safes, etc. Still, by far, the most common that we see is common. So it's pretty. I honestly can't remember the last time I saw a university receiving preferred. And warrants occur on occasion, but all of these are just very uncommon except for common. So just gonna put that out there. I realize it does happen on occasion. We'll probably get some responses in saying, oh, we did this, we did that. We realize it does happen on occasion. It happens for certain reasons, usually why the university either favors that or it's why it works out with the company. But most often it is common. Now that actually, I'm going to move on to our next question because, and this is actually a question I'm going to pose to you, Marc, and actually Bill, feel free to chime in as well, is do VCs care if the university, in this case our licensor is the university, takes equity versus a success fee, which is a percent of the company value at the liquidation event?
Yeah, we do see both types of kind of value creation for the university, equity and success fees. I would say in general, there is a preference in the venture world for equity over a success fee, because with equity, the company and the university are more aligned. And that alignment takes the place of, one wanting to make the company as valuable as possible, but also having to suffer the dilution of additional capital raises along the way. So everybody's in the same boat when you own equity. When you have a success fee, you're not totally aligned. You're still aligned on creating value, but the university gets the same success fee if the company raises $10 million or $200 million. So there's not alignment there on the amount of capital, on the impact of future dilution. And so that's why there's more of a preference for equity. We do see success fees, those can work. Sometimes they can be simpler. The key is they have to be relatively small, because the venture investors know that it's basically an undiluted amount. If you had a 5% success fee on exit, which we never see, that would be way out of market, you get 5% of the total value regardless of how much capital has been raised. And so the success fee itself, the percentage has to be fairly small. I would say 1% is the maximum, or below that. And if you're at that level, we see both deal types working. More higher equity, knowing you're going to get diluted, or a success fee of 1% or less.
Thanks, Mark. Bill, next question to you. At what point do anti-dilution clauses put startup fundraising at risk? So this question refers to the anti-dilution clause that may be in the university's agreement for non-dilution of their equity percentage to a certain point.
Yeah, I think there's a general recognition in the venture community that, the universities have this relatively small founders equity piece. As you point out, Kirsten, it's usually common. And there's a desire on the part of the institution to not have that, massively diluted by a small financing. And, that was kind of the origin of anti-dilution, that, hey, that position should be maintained through a certain amount, call it a legitimate first financing effort. And that's obviously defined by different parties in different ways. So I think most VCs, and it's hard to put an actual number on it because it depends on the company. But as these rounds we talked about earlier these early rounds have gotten larger and larger, questions have come up. At what point is the university anti-dilution? Should that kick in and kick out? How much is too much? And I think as soon as you're past kind of the $5 to $10 million financing, single-digit financing range, VCs will start pushing back. But it's all over the map. But I think there's an acknowledgement that this could be gamed in a way without an anti-dilution clause. You could come in with a small equity investment and wash out the university's ownership early. And I think if it's a legitimate financing, and that's like I said, in the eye of the beholder to some extent, then there's an acknowledgement that, yeah, the anti-dilution through that makes sense, but beyond that doesn't.
Great, thanks. And Bill, I have one other question for you. Based on OUP's most successful investments, do you have any advice on when or how to best engage regulatory consulting, the FDA, and clinical trial development experts? A lot of our finance discussion here, but it was another question that came in.
Yeah, I think getting some regulatory consultants involved as you start moving toward IND enabling studies makes sense. Some of it's pretty obvious, some of it is more nuanced, but I think at the point where you're starting to, investors would start to put some dollar figures and timelines around regulatory strategies, that's as you're moving toward an IND. And there are different, the other question is, the other aspect or question you have to answer, is this a best in class kind of me better sort of product where there's a well-trodden path and you're just going to follow that? Or is this a new molecular entity that is a very novel agent, which has a slightly different, sometimes substantially different regulatory path? Those are pretty obvious, but within those, the devil's in the details. And I think engaging a consultant early, just to give you some framework and how to think about things, is important. But I don't think it makes sense to do that much before you get to kind of a clinical candidate or something close to that.
Great, thanks, Bill. Marc, going back to our financials and particularly about equity again, what does a well-known PI typically receive for founders' equity, and how much equity should a faculty founder expect to have retained by the time an exit occurs? And I think this is going to vary perhaps broadly, but I know that we do have some data around this.
Yeah, we built a data set around this, and we showed some of that data in the webinar that we put in the chat link. And so what we did is we took about 90 of our portfolio companies, and we went back to the founding cap tables of those companies and looked at, how much did the founders own, how much did the founding CEO own, if they were a PI or not. And so we have some data that you can see in that webinar. It is a wide range. So that, I can give you some numbers here, but I would say first, it's a wide range. Second, I would say when you think about founders' equity, there are kind of two things to think about, two concepts to think about. One is rewarding past success. So what are the discoveries that led to this startup? The other is rewarding future success. And so what is it going to take from here to make the company successful down the road? The work in the future is going to be, frankly, kind of more important than the work in the past to make that company be successful. So from an investor standpoint, you want the founder's equity to go to the team that is going to be working full-time or part-time with the company. And you want less equity to go to people who may have been involved in some of the original work, but aren't involved in the startup going forward. So the involvement of the specific founders will matter in terms of how much equity they get. The more involved they will be going forward, the more equity they should get. In general, what you'll see is that kind of founding inventors often get 20% of a company or so. If they're a founding inventor and CEO, that could be as high as 40%. It varies a lot by how many people are on the team. The more founding inventors you are, the more it gets split up a little bit. If there's an outside CEO, the more it gets split up. So think about but if you're a full-time kind of faculty founder turned CEO, your equity can often be 30 or 40% to start, but that will get heavily diluted over all the way through to success. That dilution can be as much as 80%. It can be massive. It can be less. It's never going to be less than 50%. In success, or almost never less. So you should expect, think about these numbers as kind of phony numbers. Right now, they sound high, they sound great, but they get heavily diluted over time. So what you really want, if you're a founder, is by exit, you own 5 or 10% of a massively successful company. And the key is you want to get to that massively successful company. And then regardless of whether you have 1%, 5%, 10 or 20%, it will be a large amount of money.
I'll just jump in here. I think with respect to life science and biopharma companies, they generally take so much money to get to that success, to the exit point and be successful, that the founder equity at exit is often 5% or less. It's rare that a founder would still own 10% at the time the company exits, unless it's an early or surprisingly early exit, or if it's a well-known serial entrepreneurial PI who has started a series of successful companies. They can command a greater percentage of ownership at founding, and so by the time they get to exit, it might not be as dilute. But in general, it's under 5% for the founder. That's assuming they don't have an ongoing role, because the other way that founders can be rewarded is if they have an operating role in the company going forward. Then they can take advantage of the option pool and have options on top of their founder shares relative to their role in the company. And those options can be replenished round after round, and there's some anti-dilution offsets. And if there's a down round, they can re-up. So, a founder who has an operating role has a very different equity trajectory than a founder who was just given common shares when the company's first started and has no ongoing role.
Well, we have 2 more questions I think I'm going to ask, and then we'll wrap up here right on time. So another question was from our live audience on what are thoughts on change of control fees, and that they typically get pushback that investors or emerging partners won't want to proceed with the change of control fee. In my prior experience in licensing, we used change of control fees fairly often, but they weren't overly burdensome. And I think that kind of comes down to it is whether there is something that would actually be a higher hurdle for an investor to invest in the company, or for an acquirer eventually to acquire the company. And it's all a balance with your other things that are coming up as far as your financials in the license. So obviously you're trying to get to a win-win situation where if the company does well, the licensor also does well. And so to me, it is that change of control fees can be used, but you have to think about what it means eventually down the line, and whether how that impacts the other terms of the agreement as well. Anything that you 2 want to add on change of control fees?
Really?
Okay. Bill, do VCs invest and manage startups by any particular ethics standards? And I think by that, we're really talking about, is there anything you're looking for in the company to make sure that this is an investment that you would want to make for yourself and for your firm to be associated with?
Yeah, I'll break that into kind of three buckets and address them pretty quickly. So we have certain areas that we generally just don't invest in. Some of it's driven by our LPs, investors who invest in the venture fund have certain prohibitions. They tend to be pretty obvious one, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, things like that. And that's usually not an area where you see a lot of venture activity anyway. So that's out there, but not so relevant. The other thing is venture capital is a caveat emptor environment, right? There is no SEC looking out for the rights of investors the way there is in the public markets. And although you can always, be subject to lawsuits, VCs rarely, if ever, would sue or be involved in a lawsuit with a company. So, we need to be confident that the management team, the founders, and everyone associated with a startup that we're planning to invest in is high integrity and is honest and transparent. And getting back to some earlier comments, VCs are used to bad news. What they don't like is, having individuals reluctant to share bad news and therefore not being completely transparent and honest. So I think integrity and our assessment of the integrity of the management team is very important. And it comes across in a pitch, to people feel compelled to answer every question, even if they don't really know the answer or they're willing to say, I don't know. That's probably the first inkling that maybe there's an issue there. And then, there are various ethical structures that different individuals and organizations develop. And I think what we look for, and often these teams are small, so it's hard to say there's a company culture, but you look for certain obvious things like mutual respect and some sense of values that are shared among the team members. But again, it's probably too early for there to be an actual company culture, mission, vision, that sort of thing. We have a handful of folks in a company, and what we look for is that they have high integrity, they're honest, and they respect one another.
Terrific. Anything you want to add to that, Marc, or any
No.
final thoughts?
Yeah, well, the only final thought I'd have is these have been great questions, both from the live audience and then the questions we got in advance. So thank you to everyone for contributing to this.
And it worked out just perfectly. We are ending right on time. We do have a survey for those of you who so many of you actually stuck with us for this full hour and a half. Thank you. We will be posting this and sending this out to all of you soon. We have a survey that we'd love for you to take and let us know how this was for you. Give us suggestions for future webinars. We do base our webinars based on your suggestions. And we really appreciate each of you attending today. And also, Bill and Marc, thank you so much for yet again having a terrific discussion with us about the kind of inside workings of venture capital and getting people's questions answered. So thank you both so very much. And everyone have a terrific day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.